Ladies and gentlemen, time is running, so let me start very quickly. A brief introduction of a very distinguished panel. Ambassador Tacan Ildem, Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy in NATO; Adam Ward, Deputy Director, Chatham House; Professor Arad, former National Security Advisor in Israel; Richard Verly, journalist, Temps, Switzerland; and last but certainly not least, Marietta Giannakou, former Minister of Education and Religious Affairs in Greece and former member of the European Parliament. Now, the early 21st century was a watershed in terms of European security. We had this very optimistic perception in the 90s, early 2000s, about some kind of cooperative security in Europe. We also wanted to export our model of European security architecture to other troubled parts of the world. Now, this architecture seems to be collapsing. There were problems with the CFE treaty, conventional arms in Europe, for a number of years, and now the INF is no more. And that's not the end of our problems. The relationship with Russia has deteriorated. Now people talk about a new Cold War. NATO is back in its traditional mission of protecting its eastern flank from Russia. And the situation in the south is not much better, although the threat there is not as well defined. It's asymmetric, it's hybrid. We are not sure what NATO and the EU can do about this, but there are problems. And at the same time, which by itself is a positive development, the EU is becoming again more ambitious about its defense and security capabilities. But that, of course, raises once more the question of how to avoid duplication with NATO, what will be the division of labor between the two organizations. Lots of interesting questions. So let me ask our panelists to make a first comment of about 6 minutes, no more, please, so that there will be some time for discussion between the panelists and then with the audience. Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much. I should start with a positive note that this year NATO will be celebrating its 70th anniversary, and in the 70 years we could be able to provide safety, security for over 1 billion citizens of our countries, but also contributed to peace in the world. Yes, there are challenges, and I have to recall that 2014 was a watershed year with the illegitimate annexation of Crimea by Russian Federation and aggressive policies implemented thereafter. We are certainly concerned about the INF Treaty, which was one of the pillars of European security, and we have on a number of occasions the United States and allies conveyed the message that SSC-8 systems were in breach of the INF Treaty, and we still hope that in the 6 months period after the formal notification by the United States informing its intention to withdraw from the treaty, there is a window of opportunity for Russia to return to full and verifiable compliance. Now, due to the developments in 2014, NATO started to strengthen its deterrence and defense by a number of measures, by enhanced forward presence in Baltic countries and Poland, and also during the Brussels summit meeting last year, our heads of state and government agreed on the readiness initiative, and we are working on it. But I have to emphasize, and in the presence of the distinguished Russian ambassador to the European Union, that we have a dual-track policy towards Russia. One component is strong defense. The other one is meaningful dialogue with Russia. And in fact, at NATO-Russia Council meetings at ambassadorial level, we try to focus on, first and foremost, the crisis in and around Ukraine, but also use this forum to engage in discussions relating to transparency and risk reduction. Now, the second important issue is to project stability beyond NATO's borders. This requires engagement with a number of partners. And last Brussels summit's decision to launch NATO's training mission in Iraq is an important one. We would like to enhance the capacities of those partners so that they could be able to deal with specific threats and challenges that they are facing. First and foremost, countering terrorism is one area that we want them to be capable enough to deal with those threats. The third issue is you refer to some current and emerging threats, and definitely when we discuss cyber threats, hybrid tactics, disinformation, propaganda being an important component in these hybrid actions, not a single organization could be able to deal with these threats and challenges alone. It requires a comprehensive approach to have the advantages of each organization to be on the plate, and that makes NATO-EU cooperation extremely important. And in 2016 and 2018, in Warsaw and Brussels summit meetings, leaders of NATO, Secretary General Stoltenberg and Presidents Tusk and Juncker signed 2 joint declarations, and afterwards 74 common proposals were determined relating to different key areas like cybersecurity, hybrid threats, countering terrorism, energy security, and more and more we are joining forces. In terms of European defense initiatives and capabilities, I have to highlight 3 main points. First, any initiative, be it permanent structured cooperation, PESCO, or European defense funds, we, from NATO side, welcome these initiatives, provided that we all agree that NATO will remain as the cornerstone of European defense. And there shouldn't be any competition. And the statements coming from leaders of EU also confirm this understanding that there would be no competition and NATO would remain as the cornerstone of European defense. Second, we are talking about scarce resources. Therefore, we cannot have 2 sets of capabilities. And we need to make sure that whatever capabilities European Union will come with should be available for NATO's use if necessary. And third, the involvement of non-EU allies, because they are making a very important contribution. When and if Brexit happens, 80% of the defense spending would be coming from non-EU allies. So we are supportive of these European initiatives. It will also strengthen the European pillar of NATO, also help to show that European allies are making their contribution in meeting the requirements of burden sharing, fair burden sharing. So I think these are positive developments, and we are, of course, from NATO side, are engaged with our colleagues at the European Union to further this understanding.
Thank you, Ambassador, for almost keeping the time. Adam Ward, The UK is, I think, on its way out. Yes, but still a key stakeholder when it comes to European security.
Yes, indeed, and I'll try to come on to that. I think that the title of the session is European Security Strategy, and I think that a reasonable assessment would be that there isn't a great deal of evidence for a very forward-leaning, long-term, thought-out, sustainable strategy. There has been, I think, in recent years more a series of reactions, and I think that's entirely understandable given the series of shocks Europe has had to absorb externally and internally over the last few years or so. And I think it's also right to say that Europe has not overreacted to these shocks either. From a geopolitical, from a strategic sense, there's not been a kind of loss of nerve that one might have expected in the accumulation of these various challenges. And I think that to the extent that it has done things, it has also started from the premise of do no harm, a kind of a strategic Hippocratic oath, if you like. And if it adheres to that, then I think in that lies some of the components of continuing resilience. But we can't underestimate the challenge that European security faces. The attenuation, the very serious attenuation of the relationship with the United States. This is not just a matter about the degree to which the language about the transatlantic relationship has changed. It's the emergence of a conceptual chasm in regards to how alliances are conceived. And I think we've seen a very serious deterioration in transatlantic coordination on global security challenges, whether that's in respect of North Korea, whether that's in respect of the JCPOA and Iran, US policy towards Syria and Afghanistan, dealing with China, dealing with Russia, and all of those sorts of things. And it goes beyond even that, because what we've seen is the emergence of a very fundamental difference of attitude with regard to the transcending features of the global order, the rules-based international order, the child of the United States in many respects, a child that looks as if it's in risk of being orphaned by the United States, or whether it's on the issue of climate change. One can't think of a more multifaceted and potentially existential challenge and worthy of coordination than that. So in these conditions, I think it's understandable that there are voices in Europe that are talking about the requirement of developing a kind of strategic autonomy as a response to what some people see as a kind of an act of abandonment by the United States, or the United States turning itself into the sort of power, at the moment at least, with whom it's very difficult to do business on these issues. I think it's understandable, but taken at its face value, I think it's also misplaced. It's misplaced because it doesn't allow for the possible transience of what the Trump administration is and what it represents, and the possibility of reversion of the United States to more classical forms of leadership as it's conceived them in the past. I think it doesn't sufficiently actually use the row that Trump has created over the question of European defense spending to have a more thoroughgoing conversation about what are the requirements of making NATO an even more effective organization. And I think obviously the aspiration to a full form of strategic autonomy exaggerates Europe's independent capability on the global stage. And it also risks producing a self-fulfilling prophecy of American estrangement as Europe tries to gather more resources. So by all means, more spending, more strategy, more coordination, more resources, but not strategic autonomy. Think more in terms of strategic patience. Now, in terms of Europe and the United Kingdom, I think here too, the decision of the United Kingdom to amputate itself from the European Union has strategic implications. They're primarily, I think, in the first instance, and I speak as somebody who comes from the UK, British. I think that we're likely to find ourselves in a situation that we've not experienced in living memory, namely a simultaneous detachment and estrangement from the United States and Europe. These things happening at the same time. There's always been a feature in British foreign policy to tilt more towards America or to tilt more towards Europe, depending on what the issue was. Occasionally there has been an aspiration to provide a bridging function, but we've never had the sort of situation that we're facing now. And it's a very uncomfortable prospect for us. And I think, obviously, we've never, as a country, been entirely independent of or shielded from developments in the continent. And we've always had very predictable, very established mechanisms of engaging and protecting our interests and making a contribution. And a lot of those look now much more doubtful than they have been. And from a British perspective also, it's clear that the aspiration to global Britain, this is the mantra of the Brexiteers, risks in these circumstances becoming a synonym for strategic overstretch in Britain. Now, at the same time, I think Europe obviously has a significant interest in continuing to make sure that Britain is included, is enclosed in the European architecture. And there's a common duty, I think, between Europe and the UK not to let the current recriminations and the antagonisms and the potentially looming car crash of Brexit undermine those structures that have been built up over many years. I think the other pillar of a European security strategy is that of Russia, and the ambassador has already spoken about that, so in the interests of time I'm not going to dwell on that. But I would just, in my closing moments, refer to the question of China, which from a European security perspective at times in the past has seemed a very remote consideration. But I would say that it's possible to make the proposition that the real test for the ability of Europe to develop a long-range global security strategy and calculus is whether it can fashion some sort of a sustainable approach towards China. Because China obviously is incredibly important. Many of our interests, economically and otherwise, are tied up with it, but a number of security challenges too. There's a great deal of ambiguity about China. Its future is not foreordained. It can go in lots of different directions, and it's possible to read China in a number of different ways. It has a strategic culture that outwardly articulates the notion of win-win outcomes, but it also has certain core interests about which it can be very shrill. It talks in rhetorical terms with resort to soft power concepts, but it's developed a large number of hard power capacities and continues to do that. It doesn't want to overthrow the existing international order, but it does want to make a series of evolutionary adjustments that reflect its interests more closely than they do at the present time. It's a vital economy, but sometimes in its economic foreign policy, it can take a more extractive approach. And some of its larger initiatives, including the Belt and Road initiatives, which are going to touch on European interests too, have a certain geopolitical undercurrent to them, which is manifest and plain for all to see. So on this question, it's surprising to me that the United States and Europe haven't found closer common ground in respect to the management of that particular issue, a long-term strategic issue such as China, where I think the instincts do begin to converge. I think it's a reminder to Europe also that it can't neglect the wider considerations about the multipolarity of Asia, the concerns of Japan that can be brought into its own interests, and that a European security strategy ultimately has to be, in psychological terms as well as in practical terms, one that takes a global perspective.
Well, thank you for bringing China into the discussion. I think it's important. So I suppose your basic message is patience, less than 2 years left with the Trump administration. That's almost a happy thought. But let me then ask Professor Arad, what's the view like from Europe South?
Well, you know, the full landscape just described of the many challenges, issues that need to be addressed by Europe and in the context of European security, and the multiple issues of all kinds, ranging from strategic to geopolitical and the like, just demonstrates the phenomenon that indeed never before do I remember had been such a rich agenda of issues of different characters and different levels, all of which are problematic, some of which are unprecedented in their formation. And what they pose is indeed a challenge for strategy, which is that is the issue that's been addressed. But within that context, it is a management problem. How does one manage on such multiple fronts something which is sensible and is efficient in ways? So the question about the European institutions and how that should come about would therefore involve the issue of how does one have a strategy, if at all, which combines and unifies and at the same time is managed well. Now, I would like to add to what had been said a few more points which would simply symbolize the sheer weight of all those many issues which in combination become very dangerous indeed. I don't know how many. I do suspect that, well, many people keep, a kind of a quiet or composed, but there is a concern, there is an underlying concern that there are too many flashpoints and there are too many irreconcilable factors and there are too many things and too many moving parts. Something will give. On a totally different region, which hopefully does not project into Europe, we've just been an incident in India and Pakistan, which is precisely the kind of thing that could have gone wrong. And it is so fortunate that the parties are demonstrating an ability to deal with that, which renders one to be optimistic on the kind of thing. But this is the area where things could go wrong. Fortunately, this theater does not project into Europe. But there are others who do come, and they come from the Middle East, and therefore, from my point of view as a non-European, but in a way concerned and interested, let me add to what had been said. Well, first, when it comes to the global issues, indeed the China factor has to be addressed. It poses a dilemma to Europeans, but in particular, for example, it poses specific dilemmas to two countries. One is Greece, where you have an interesting Chinese interest, a maritime one, and more recently, we in Israel have been facing the same. You wouldn't believe that, but the Chinese are building our national seaport, where we have our navy, and the Americans approached us expressing concern that this is just letting the Chinese too much. So we are now caught in a dilemma, which in a way would be not unlike the one that Europe too will be facing. That is to say, a country which feels itself anchored in the Atlantic Alliance and feels on the side of the Western Alliance, that is to say North America and Europe, but at the same time facing is even closer to a Chinese phenomenon which has in it certain realities, some of which are not necessarily adverse. So China is a major issue that should be addressed perhaps in consultation and in a smart way in face of all the difficulties. The second issue, which I would mention, had been mentioned, Russia. Now, Russia for Europe has been expressed mostly in the context of the Eastern Europe issues, from which we in the Middle East are distant. But Israel, in a way, has a special relationship with Russia, which has to do with other factors, one of which is now of the enhanced Russian place in Syria. Now, this is also a maritime issue because only recently Russia had prolonged its contract, a lease on the port of Tartus in Syria, which has obvious strategic value to Russia. And Russia is a factor here to stay on the Eastern Mediterranean, basing itself in accordance with what it perceives its national security requirements in Syria. So that is something that is taken into account, which is interesting by itself. But this also brings into the question the bigger issue of Syria, which had not been mentioned. Now, Syria, does Syria project onto European security? Of course it does, in so many other ways. Migratory pressures have not been mentioned until now, but they have been a factor in last years, and then some of it comes from Syria. Because at the end of the day, without being too sentimental, Syria is a terrible, terrible, terrible human misery and an enormous degree of destruction that had been affected on this country. Luckily, this civil war is coming to an end, but it is coming to an end with a certain ending that need be considered. At the moment, the parties who are more influential in shaping the end of this situation are Turkey, a NATO partner, which has a special interest in there, but being European and NATO member is to be considered, is Russia, as mentioned. Lebanon, poor Lebanon, also affected by that. Lebanon, a country in which Europe has long taken interest. But then comes Iran. We have not talked about Iran until this moment. Now, why is that? In some ways, Iran and the future of the nuclear deal with Iran has been very much at the heart of dispute between the United States and the other members of the Five and so forth, and what to do about it. The fact that America walked out of the deal, the other members, signatories, remained with the deal, Iran included, is interesting. The fact that Israel did what it did is a separate issue. I'm not here to say anything about it, only to suggest to you that in many ways, many Israeli experts would have sided with the position of remaining with the deal and trying to improve on it rather than bringing about its abrogation. But the fact remains that the issue of Iran is a serious issue which goes beyond just the issue of the nuclear deal. When you talk about the nuclear deal, you would have to address that issue. What is to be done? Should one go back to a negotiated agreement to try to resolve the current impasse? That's a separate issue in which many are concerned. But Iran, as we found in the Warsaw meeting the other day, Iran is also a matter of concern because of its more aggressive and expansive strategies in the Saudi Peninsula, in Lebanon itself, in Syria, and that is a real flashpoint. We, in effect, are engaged in a kind of a fighting war for now a few years, fighting Iranian forces. That's a very unpleasant reality. That had been addressed with Russia and so forth. Should Iran be encouraged to evacuate Syria? That's a serious matter. But the fact remains that Iran is a matter of concern to many in the Middle East, all of which have met under the orchestration of the United States in Warsaw, but consist of the many states of the Gulf, and therefore a joint position on Iran, one that would contain its nuclear ambitions, is becoming imperative. By the way, this ties in with the third and strategic level that had been discussed, the dissolution of some of the arms control agreements of the past, the INF issue, the nuclear thing, which is very much now a matter of American-Russian engagement. This is a most serious development. And here, much work need be done to accommodate those issues. It is simply impossible to consider the unraveling of agreements. One has to work on creatively on finding different equilibria, perhaps, on those matters, and that has to be done because neglect here could be catastrophic, and again, things could go wrong on this matter. So this is the strategic domain to which proliferation of nuclear weapons or the Iranian issue is also a derivative of. One last point. You know, it is so gratifying to sit on a discussion of European security and hear nothing about the Arab-Israeli issue. For many, many years, Israelis have wanted to be neglected. But this time, I don't think we should be neglected. The Arab-Israeli issue is a serious issue. It's high time that it be addressed effectively, and this calls, of course, on Israel no less than on the others. Now, here we have a tiny surprise. Whereas the United States is in the process of withdrawing from the Middle East and reducing its presence, here on the one, it is now holding a kind of a formula for the deal of the century that should be presented in the next few weeks or so, with much fanfare and with some support from Arab states. And who knows, some would caricature that, some would consider that a folly, some would be very skeptical, the issue being what it is. They would say that there is nothing to be gained. But I'm one would say that it is very much in the interest of stability and resolving issues that this initiative be seized, if only because it's an idea and the new idea in town, and therefore that should generate some interest. Now, Europe, in the past, has taken interest. Look how the quartet has disappeared from the scene, which was the thing that, that is no longer valid. But I would suggest that this would become also a medium priority issue on the template of issues for the when this comes on the Arab-Israeli issue. Now, one last joke. We didn't talk about democracy, but you know, democracy, which is invention of this country, in which we have been much applauded, but in this time it is a much abused system because it's the most amenable one to cyber manipulation. So the more democratic you are, the more vulnerable you are to that kind of thing. So now what I'm about to say is a joke, please. I'm taking a high risk of saying it. But you know, my prime minister just visited Moscow and he talked tete-a-tete with Putin. Now the joke of the town is that two of them colluded how to rig the Israeli elections. Now, now, you know, both of them could help each other. You know, Bibi could ask Putin to say, come on, you decide the issue, you can do it. So you do it. But, you know, who knows what's Putin's interest in this? Does he really want to collude with Bibi? Anyway, the two of them could do it, which gives you an idea. If that is about to happen, we could do away with elections. They are so costly. All one has to do is to engage the Russians and your own politicians and simply leapfrog over this slow, problematic process of holding those elections every other month. That's the good part of cyber. Thank you.
Thank you. I just hope the Middle Eastern Initiative is a bit better prepared than the negotiations between the US and North Korea. Charverly, le Temps is based in Geneva. We don't have that many peace negotiations currently. Is that a good sign? No need for peace negotiations, or is it a bad sign? We are far away from even negotiating for various issues.
Well, part of the peace negotiation on Syria is taking place in Geneva, but unfortunately, the process has not shown any results so far. I guess the reason for me to sit in this panel is because I was a correspondent in Brussels covering the EU and NATO for quite a while, for about 7 years, while working for a Swiss newspaper, and you understand that Switzerland, being neutral, is not a NATO member country. It just happened that in Brussels, we are part, Switzerland, of the Partnership for Peace, and the Swiss delegation at NATO is sitting at the same floor with the Russian delegation. We are sharing the same floor in that building aside the new NATO headquarters. Just 3 points, maybe. When you talk about the strategy for the European security, you're aiming at obstacles to remove or challenges to be overcome. So what is the strategy you need to remove those obstacles? I would see at the moment, not talking about all the challenges you mentioned, 3 mainly political and psychological challenges that you have to face when it comes to European security. The first one is a clear question of double language. And I would explain myself, Europeans continue to say that they have to be autonomous, that you have even to build a European army, especially considering the situation in the White House. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to weaponry, when it comes to tools, when it comes to instruments, there is a difficulty to achieve that, because you, NATO, need the United States very much. And I would take 2 examples. Recently, Belgium decided to buy American fighters, jet fighters, rather than European jet fighters. And another example, which is the question of drones. You know how much drones are absolutely indispensable now on military conflict. And at the moment, though there is a drone program, a European drone program, but if you need drone, you've got to buy them mostly either from the US or, I understand, from Israel as well. So the question of double language, you can't always pretend you have the possibility to become autonomous when in reality you need to purchase equipment from those respective countries. Second question I see is the question of confidence between European and NATO governments. I am making here a difference because you know that all the European Union countries are not in the same position towards NATO. You've got some neutral country within the European Union. Question of confidence, because at the moment, clearly, the confidence is not there. When you sit at the table, either at NATO or at the European Union, though the communiqué at the end seems to be unanimous, in reality, there is a level of distrust, even on security matters, between the West and the East, let's say France, Germany, Poland, and so on, but also because migration is a security issue, distrust is in between the North and the South. So how do you overcome that level of distrust, which is now, to me, undermining European security? And before talking about the Russian threat or the Chinese threat, you better make sure that you have a certain level of trust within allies. And at the moment, I'm afraid that trust is fading a bit, even on security issues. Then the third point I wanted to make is about the link with the people of Europe. We talked about this in the panel before. There was this notion of empowerment. People now, through the different social movement and political convulsions in Europe, have shown that they want to be involved and they want to understand what's going on. Let's take an example, which is the so-called Russian threat to the European Union and to Europe. I understand that there are, movement, especially cyber threat, that are seriously and should be seriously addressed. My point is, when I'm covering France at the moment, I'm based in Paris, when you go in the fields, let's say in the small city where you have all these yellow jacket social movement, and you talk with them about the Russian threat, they just don't feel it at all, and they even tell you that the only channel which is telling the truth about France is RT, the Russian television. So how do you, how do you address that? On the one hand, you have your government based on studies, on reports saying that Russia is a threat. It might be true. I'm not answering that question. The government is saying that Russia is manipulating the information, manipulating the cyber, whatever domain. Okay, but the fact of the matter is the people don't see it this way. And they sometimes, very often, prefer to read information on Sputnik, on RT, because they say that those media outlet ask the right questions about the situation. So my point here is you can't always pretend to define the security agenda without convincing your own people that your security priority are right and straight. And at the moment, there is distrust also between the European governments and the European people because they don't see the same threat.
Thank you very much. Minister Giannakou, during your time in the European Parliament, you spent a lot of time and effort on European defense issues. So let me ask you, how ambitious should Europe be about its defense and security capabilities, and how optimistic you are about the prospects?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me speak in Greek. Κύριε Πρόεδρε, πολύ σημαντικό το ερώτημά σας. Ήδη οι προλαλήσαντες σημείωσαν διάφορες υποτιθέμενες απειλές και άρα την ανάγκη, παραδείγματος χάρη, να αυξήσει η Ευρώπη τις δυνατότητές της ή τουλάχιστον να συμβάλλει περισσότερο στην οικονομική πλατφόρμα του ΝΑΤΟ. Λόγω της ύπαρξης της Ευρωζώνης και του περιορισμού των δαπανών, δηλαδή της δημοσιονομικής πειθαρχίας, πράγματι υπάρχει ένα πολιτικό ζήτημα. Οι λαοί στην Ευρώπη διερωτώνται πώς είναι δυνατόν να γίνονται περικοπές στην υγεία, στην παιδεία κτλ. Και να γίνονται τόσα έξοδα για την ύπαρξη μιας στρατηγικής για την ασφάλεια. Απ' την άλλη πλευρά, με το Brexit, τελικά το 80% των εξόδων θα βρίσκεται εκτός Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης. Δηλαδή, Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες και Βρετανία. Πρέπει να σημειώσουμε ότι υπάρχει ένα δίκαιο στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες και σε αυτά που έχουν υποθεί, γιατί πραγματικά η Ευρώπη, αν θέλει να έχει μια δική της δομή, δεν συμβάλλει περισσότερο στα έξοδα του ΝΑΤΟ. Εγώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε, πιστεύω ότι η ύπαρξη της ρήτρας άμυνας και αλληλεγγύης, αυτά που αναφέρονται ως Ευρωστρατός, δηλαδή να μπορεί η Ένωση μέσα σε 60 μέρες να έχει 60.000 στρατιώτες τους οποίους να διατηρεί επί ένα χρόνο, περισσότερο έχουν σημασία για το μέλλον της Ευρώπης και τη δομή, την πολιτική της Ευρώπης, παρά ως έννοιες για την αντιμετώπιση πραγματικών απειλών. Διότι ναι, μεν θεωρείται ότι υπάρχει απειλή, παραδείγματος χάρη, από τη Ρωσική Ομοσπονδία, αλλά στην ουσία η Ευρώπη έχει και εξάρτηση στο ενεργειακό επίπεδο από τη Ρωσική Ομοσπονδία. Από την συνθήκη του Μάστριχτ άρχισε για πρώτη φορά η Ευρώπη να ασχολείται με το θέμα της ύπαρξης μιας ενιαίας στρατηγικής για την ασφάλεια και την άμυνα. Στην ουσία όμως, μετά τη συνθήκη της Λισαβόνας, και εκεί αισθάνομαι πραγματικά περήφανη, γιατί το άρθρο το αντίστοιχο που αφορούσε στη ρήτρα αλληλεγγύης ήμουν τελικά ο αρχικός συντάκτης, λαμβάνοντας υπόψη το άρθρο 42 παράγραφος 7 καθώς και το άρθρο 222, ότι δηλαδή η Ένωση έχει την υποχρέωση, εάν απειληθεί οποιαδήποτε χώρα της Ευρώπης, συνολικά να στηρίξει το ευρωπαϊκό κράτος μέλος, το οποίο θα δεχθεί απειλές, πάσης φύσεως απειλές, τρομοκρατική απειλή, απειλή από φυσικές καταστροφές κτλ., αποτελεί μια βάση ουσιαστική για να δημιουργηθούν περισσότερες δυνατότητες στην Ευρώπη. Πώς μπορούν σε μια εποχή δημοσιονομικής πειθαρχίας? Πρώτα απ' όλα μπορούν με την κοινή παραγωγή οπλικών συστημάτων. Όταν στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες παράγονται τάγκς από μία γραμμή και στην Ευρώπη από 16 γραμμές, αντιλαμβάνεται κανείς το μεγάλο κόστος για το οποίο θα υπήρχαν πολύ μεγάλες τριβές και στο πολιτικό επίπεδο. Δεύτερον, με την έξοδο της Βρετανίας παραμένει μόνο η Γαλλία ως πυρηνική δύναμη. Έχει η Ευρώπη ποτέ βρει τον τρόπο να λειτουργήσει συνολικά? Ναι, μία άσκηση ήταν στο κέρας της Αφρικής και πραγματικά υπήρξε ουσιαστική συνεργασία υπό την εποπτεία της Βαρόνης Άστον, η οποία ήταν αντιπρόεδρος της Ευρωπαϊκής Επιτροπής. Εγώ είμαι αισιόδοξη, κύριε Πρόεδρε. Και είμαι αισιόδοξη ακριβώς όπως σας είπα, γιατί η ύπαρξη ευρωπαϊκής στρατηγικής, του Ευρωπαϊκού Οργανισμού Άμυνας, των προσπαθειών που γίνονται από όλους και κυρίως από τις χώρες της Μπενελούξ και τη Γαλλία, αλλά και από χώρες όπως η Ελλάδα, στο βάθος έχουν ως στόχο, μέσα σε μακροπρόθεσμη προοπτική, ένα είδος πιο πολιτικής και πιο ομοσπονδιακής Ευρώπης. Εάν δεν συμβεί αυτό, δηλαδή εάν δεν τύχει σημασίας η δημιουργία ενός ευρωπαϊκού συστήματος άμυνας, χωρίς αυτό να υπονομεύει το ΝΑΤΟ, τότε θα είναι πολύ πιο δύσκολο να υπάρξει μια πολιτική Ευρώπη στο βάθος του χρόνου. Βέβαια, ορισμένοι επιμένουν ότι η Ευρώπη είναι μια ήπια δύναμη και δεν είναι σωστό να δημιουργήσει ένα τέτοιο σύστημα. Άλλοι, οι οποίοι είναι ατλαντιστές, φοβούνται ότι η Ευρώπη μπορεί να υπονομεύσει το ΝΑΤΟ μέσα από μια τέτοια διαδικασία. Τίποτα από τα δύο δεν είναι αλήθεια. Αν θέλουμε ως Ευρωπαίοι να κάνουμε πραγματικές αλλαγές, δηλαδή να δώσουμε μια ελπίδα σε μια πιο πολιτική Ευρώπη, πρέπει οπωσδήποτε να έχουμε ένα σύστημα που θα στηρίζει τη ρήτρα άμυνας και τη ρήτρα αλληλεγγύης. Αυτό θα βοηθήσει και τις μικρότερες χώρες να αισθάνονται πιο άνετα. Βέβαια, αν ρωτήσει κανείς το λαό, αισθάνεστε απειλούμενοι από τη Ρωσική Ομοσπονδία, από το Ιράν, από τη Συρία, εάν λησμονήσουμε την ύπαρξη του μεταναστευτικού ρεύματος και των προσφύγων, θα απαντήσουν όχι πιθανόν. Αισθάνονται περισσότερο απειλούμενοι από την περικοπή των δαπανών, από την αδυναμία να στηριχθούν οι νέες τεχνολογίες που υπάρχουν στον χώρο της υγείας, της παιδείας. Ωστόσο, εάν θέλουμε συνολικά να παίξει ένα ρόλο η Ευρώπη στο παγκόσμιο σύστημα, πρέπει να υπάρξει μια κοινή άμυνα και ένας διαμοιρασμός των ικανοτήτων. Όχι το απλό pooling and sharing, όπως γίνεται εδώ και χρόνια, αλλά ένας πραγματικός από κοινού διαμοιρασμός, χωρίς να αφήσουμε το ΝΑΤΟ και να εγκαταλείψουμε το ΝΑΤΟ, το οποίο αποτελεί τη βασική αρχή και το βασικό σύστημα έναντι οποιασδήποτε απειλής. Βέβαια, οι νέες απειλές είναι, όπως αντιλαμβάνεστε, τελείως διαφορετικές. Ασύμμετρες απειλές, διαδικτυακές απειλές, ο κυβερνοχώρος. Όμως, ο στόχος της Ευρώπης και ο στόχος του ΝΑΤΟ στην ουσία, όπως δημιουργήθηκε μετά τον πόλεμο, ήταν ακριβώς να υπάρξει η προστασία αυτού που θεωρήθηκε ως ο δυτικός και δημοκρατικός κόσμος, δηλαδή ο κόσμος της ευημερίας, των ανθρωπίνων και ατομικών δικαιωμάτων και των θεμελιωδών ελευθεριών. Ας μην ξεχνάμε ότι η Ευρώπη δεν είχε πραγματική δημοκρατία ποτέ, ούτε πριν τον πόλεμο, ούτε η δημοκρατία της Βαϊμάρης, ούτε η δημοκρατία του Λέον Μπλουμ ήταν πραγματικές δημοκρατίες. Πραγματική δημοκρατία απίλαυσαν οι πολίτες της Ευρώπης και πραγματικές δυνατότητες μετά τον πόλεμο. Και αυτό δεν πρέπει σε καμία περίπτωση να χαθεί από την Ευρώπη. Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε.
Thank you, Minister. Although I must say I always have a small disagreement, not with you, but with those that claim that the energy relationship between Europe and Russia is one of dependence. Europe needs to buy, but Russia needs to sell. So I think there is more interdependence there. But be that as it may, I would like to end our discussion on a more positive note, if possible. I'm unhappy about the designation of Russia, and I know there are good reasons for that, but as a hostile nation. I prefer to see it as a difficult neighbor, but since that neighbor is going to stay with us, I would like to ask the question, can we have a reset of relations between Europe or the West and Russia? Can we establish a working relationship? Now, the ambassador mentioned the dual policy of NATO. Unfortunately, we don't have a Russian voice in the panel. I would be happy if Ambassador Tizov would like to tell us his view in 3 minutes and then 1 minute for each member of the panel to react or answer the question. Is there a microphone for the ambassador? It's coming.
Thank you. Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Well, as the popular saying goes, there are two kinds of people you don't choose. One is your parents, the other is your neighbors. Unless you move out, of course. So, let me give just a few comments. the double-track approach. I must admit, the second track is hardly visible. Even the Russia-NATO Council, or the NATO-Russia Council, which is formally in existence, doesn't have a positive agenda to deal with. We had a discussion, and actually high-level Russian representative, Deputy Minister Ryabkov, came last time for discussion on the fate of the INF Treaty, and it came to nothing. I will add that all our efforts to engage the United States in a bilateral dialogue on the issue also came to nothing. The only reply that we got from Washington and NATO: scrap the missile, and then we'll talk. That's not the way to deal with these issues. And I will remind you, well, some of us belong to the generation that can remember how the INF Treaty came about in 1987. There were discussions both in the United States and the Soviet Union then, who gained more, who lost more. But what was without any doubt is that the biggest beneficiary of that treaty was Europe. Now, when I see that the European Union adopts, I would say, a substantial statement in support of the INF Treaty now, and then EU member states go to the General Assembly of the United Nations and in their majority vote against a Russian draft resolution in support of the INF Treaty. Only 4 EU member states abstained, and I think this is the time and place to name them: Austria, Ireland, Cyprus, and Malta. Actually, 2 others who are not members of NATO supported the NATO view. On Bibi Putin collusion, well, you know, I sometimes feel that there is, I would say, a discrepancy in approach towards my country. On the one hand, people are saying that Russian economy is in shatters, Russia is in decline, about to disappear whatsoever, and then at the same time, Russia is omnipowerful, able to define the results of elections and referenda all over the world. Well, you guys should be more consistent. Then, I think our Swiss colleague was quite correct, saying that when it comes to weapons, military hardware, the European countries, I wouldn't share the formula that they need to purchase US arms. They are obliged to purchase US arms. Of course, there are alternative sources, as the ambassador's home country will certainly confirm, to find the best weapons available. Finally, when we talk about EU strategic autonomy, PESCO, I followed quite attentively how the idea of PESCO first surfaced and how it developed, how it evolved, and how it degenerated in a way. Because it all started as an idea of Europe, the European Union, acquiring some real autonomy, which was very much in line what the United States had been pushing their European allies towards, that they should be doing more in the area of defense and so on. But as soon as the European allies made a first step in the direction in the form of PESCO, immediately Washington said, no, 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 you should not go too far on that. And then it turned out that the focus of attention switched to certain joint projects like strategic mobility, or in other words, military Schengen, which of course, in plain terms, is the EU taxpayer fulfilling NATO agenda. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to have this audience not to leave this room with the notion that we are back to Cold War years. No, we are not, and we are not aiming that. But at the same time, we have to be honest with each other. As I mentioned, 2014 was a watershed year in terms of European security. And as long as we see the illegal annexation of Crimea and aggressive policies in eastern Ukraine, Donbas region, I don't think that NATO could be able to go to business as usual. So what I mean with that, we will maintain the political dialogue at NRC, NATO-Russia Council level, but practical cooperation cannot be resumed. Second, on INF, I'm also one of those who took part in not only the 1987 process as part of the consultations, but even earlier than that, in 1979, when dual-track decision was taken by NATO, on the one hand, to initiate a process by which negotiations could take place between the United States and then Soviet Union, but at the same time to think about the deployment of Pershing missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles, Pershings and cruise. And we cannot just say it was for the interest of European allies only, because the deployment of these systems could also have had a bearing on the security of the Soviet Union. Therefore, INF Treaty is a very valuable instrument, and we need to maintain, in dealing with the complex security challenges of our time, multilateralism, but also to cherish and respect the letter and spirit of these instruments. One is INF Treaty, the other one is OSCE's Vienna document, for instance, for transparency and risk reduction. And when there is a breach of an instrument, and in this case we see that SSC 8 is in clear violation of the INF Treaty, you cannot just expect one side to abide by the rules and the other to have the freedom to violate it. So it needs two to tango. And we still hope that INF Treaty could be maintained by Russian Federation to return to full and verifiable compliance. One word on transatlantic bonds, because it is always good to talk about the European capabilities and the European Union's role and involvement in this process. But in any case, we need to keep in mind that for such a sustainable, good European security strategy, NATO should be the cornerstone of the European defense, and we should maintain the transatlantic bond as strong as possible. And one last word on making all of our policies understood by our publics, and I very much agree with my Swiss colleague that we should link it to our publics. There was a peace dividend after the Cold War, And our publics were very much focused on the need to allocate resources, not to defense spending, but to education, healthcare. But now, in this complex security environment with so many unpredictable challenges, we have to explain to our publics how important it is to allocate resources for our defense, to maintain our citizens safe and secure, and also protect our freedoms. Because after all, we should not forget that threats and challenges emanating from different directions are targeting our values, very principles that we are sharing and cherishing. Thank you.
Those were two last words, Ambassador, but they were good points. I'm under heavy pressure by the organizers. If you feel the need to say your own last word, can you do it in 30 seconds? Whoever.
That's a lot of pressure. I'm not an expert on Russia, but I occasionally speak to people who are, and they refer to a kind of a dual-track process that Russia has itself. It conducts its diplomacy with reference to questions about legitimate interests. Huge amount of energy is invested on these technical aspects of armaments treaties and all the rest of it. And yet, there seems to be something in the Russian strategic calculus to these observers which needs confrontation with the West as an important source of its own sense of its status and its standing. And I think that is, for those experts, then a reflection that the history of bilateral diplomacy between Europe or the West and Russia has been that Russia has not been in a position where it has felt able to take a sort of yes for an answer. And that's a matter of perception. The ambassador obviously has a different view. And to answer your own question, yes, you can be economically weak and geopolitically powerful at the same time if you're willing to take certain steps that are considered by a majority of countries around the world not to be, let's say, entirely lawful or legitimate. And it's part of the puzzle for many people who don't know Russia as well as some people on the panel here is why there is this kind of a historic choice that Russia appears to have been making, which is instead of working towards a relationship with the West that's basically grounded on some sense of equanimity and equality, it is opting for a geopolitical calculus that is going to put it into a position of junior status with regard to China over the long term. I understand that Russia does not feel it has binary choices to make, but to detached observers, that seems to be at least the direction of travel.
Very quick about this so-called cyber threat and the necessity to address them. I'm just worried that, again, for many people, it appears as a way to curb political freedom and especially the expression of alternative thinking. And that's a problem. At the moment, if you go again in France, if you tell people about the necessity to resist cyber threat, they will tell you that is a way to shut us down. And I think we can't escape that. We are at a time in Europe when people want to be heard because they feel they are not heard. So you can't just decide to get rid of some information of the internet because of security reason, while people consider this is part of the freedom of expression that they want.
Thank you.
The existence of European defense strategy is very important, as I said, for the global presence of the European Union. You remember that in the United States they said, if I want to speak with a country, I have a telephone contact with someone. In Europe, who is responsible? Europe has to have a European defense strategy anyway, and this can help in the relationship with Russia and the United States without leaving the NATO. NATO is the basis, But Europe has not only the opportunity, but the necessity to create a real European strategy of defense, and not only. On the other side, with a global presence for humanitarian aid, for anything. Many people in the third world see Europe as the best place for democracy, for good life, for human rights. And I think we don't have to leave this and to forget this.
Thank you very much, Minister. Let me apologize for not having time for discussion at the end and for keeping you from lunch, but please join me in thanking our panelists for this interesting discussion.